All right, we are recording. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Virtual Brown Bag, the place we get together every Thursday. So what is this thing all about? Of course, first and foremost, privacy warning, right? We are recording these meetings since we encourage people to share, whatever comes to mind, or maybe not anything that comes to mind. Think about it right before you say it. But, just don't share anything that could cause you trouble because this is going to be available on the internet later so that people who could not join in can catch up later, or even those who did join but decide I'm pretty sure that George shared something about TypeScript a couple of weeks ago. Where is it? Well, here we can review things later, which I find valuable. I'm always like going back to rewatch things because I keep that information that I remember, this person or that person talking about X. I don't remember the details, but I know where to go find it, right? So that's been working out well for me, and that's why we have the recordings. So what is a VBB? It's a place where we get together, and we share tips, tricks, experiences, maybe something you've learned the hard way and you feel like sharing with others. So that's you can make somebody else's life easier for a change, which is always appreciated. Maybe frustrations or difficulties. You're trying to get something done and you cannot, for the life of you, figure it out. Throw it out here. Maybe somebody somebody else has gone through the same trouble and can help you out, or at least, point you out in the right direction. So we do this every Thursday, right, from 12 to 1 Central Time here on Skype. Anybody and everybody willing to share or learn is more than welcome. We are really all over the place. We just don't talk about C# only or JavaScript only, or you name it. It's really anything that appeals to you, that you feel passionate talk about. Maybe you hate it passionately, right? Share that, right? Maybe somebody can help you out putting a different perspective on the topic, whatever it is. I know that I've hated certain things in the past because of the way I was approaching it, and then when I was presented with a different perspective, I'm like, oh, I was looking at it all wrong. Thank you very much. Right. So this is why we do these things, and always very valuable. We have a virtualbrownbag.com website where you can always find the link to this meeting here, as well as the link to the previous recordings. Right. So if you scroll down the page, you're going to be finding those links over there with a little description as to what we talked about that day. And without further ado, let's just keep talking about stuff. Anybody has anything to bring up? Any news from the last 7 days?
I've actually like not been coding.
You haven't been coding?
I've been coding so little. So I was so Sci-Fi DevConf was supposed to be this week. No, today actually. So getting my like org mode and Farscape presentation ready was like a big one that I was trying to do, and then like 5 days ago or something, they emailed and they were like, full disclosure, we've only had 10 people like buy tickets for the entire conference, so guess we're just gonna cancel it. Which sucks because it's such a fun idea for a conference, and they had like pretty awesome speakers lined up. Yeah, so I spent like a lot of time at the end of last week and then during the weekend like prepping this presentation and like trying to get all my slides set up and I decided to do slides in Emacs, so they all look awful, but
right.
It's not a pretty platform. It's really cool because I'm going to be able to do like all sorts of dynamic stuff, like modifying the slide deck as I'm presenting in order to demonstrate concepts. But it is not like it's not. Yeah, it's not pretty.
Right.
But yeah, so I was doing that, and then like there were just a couple days where I was just completely busy with putting together architecture diagrams for potential projects. Like barely got to touch code. I think I've gotten to write like 2 lines of Racket I needed to do to dedupe a list of emails, and that's about it.
Okay.
Lots of other conversations going on though. Interesting.
Okay.
But I'll let other people kind of answer what they've been up to.
Sure. Yeah, I see. We have Alper, we have John, we have Tony on the call. Anything you guys would like to bring up?
I'll just say that, like George, I've been coding like a madman lately, which is great.
Yeah.
After having a couple of clients where I didn't do all that much coding, it's really kind of fun. And I'm using, some new technologies, new to me anyway.
Okay.
So that's pretty exciting.
Interesting. What kind of technologies, John?
Well, I'm doing an entire application in F#. It's
Nice.
Fable React Elvish on the front end,
Hmm.
and just some straight up F# with actually using F# Dapper to do
Nice.
the database side of stuff. Um, and so that's really interesting. I'm going to put together a presentation on it at some point when I've got some time. But
Okay.
um,
Let me ask. I haven't heard of a F-sharp Dapper. Is Dapper the ORM thing, or is it?
it's just a little wrapper
Okay.
that somebody did
Okay.
over Dapper. So basically, you hand it an F# record and it does the inserts and selects and everything. It's you know it's relatively simple. It covers the usual insert, select, update kind of stuff.
Okay.
Uh, if you have to do anything complicated with lots of joins, you need to do that. Just straight up Dapper. But
Okay.
Uh,
Interesting.
yeah.
but I
F
think
sharp. Are you finding that F sharp is like you're having an easy time writing idiomatic F sharp, or are you like you're like I'm just writing code, I don't know really even what idiomatic F sharp is, or how do you feel about that?
I'm mostly getting the idiomatic F# stuff.
Okay.
It's This is the first time I've actually used this on a real world project, but I've done a lot of F# on my own and some practice stuff. Um, it's kind of interesting. There's one other consultant on the project with me, and he's new to F#, but he's been picking it up pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think we've had more issues with some of the using components and things that fit into all this because it's not quite as slick as the whole, Visual Studio, C#, add packages and NuGet, everything's fine. There's a little more infrastructure there,
Mm-hmm.
but generally it's worked out really well.
Okay. Um, yeah. I know. I remember the local functional programming group. There's a guy that did a presentation on how he converted like he did a project in F sharp, and he was like, I had to write this 3 times. Where like I wrote it once and then just realized I had just taken my C sharp code and just written it with like a F sharp flavor. And it's like and then I did it again trying to like use their libraries. And then I eventually had like the aha moment where I was like, no, none of this should work like that. And he's like, I had to rewrite it a third time.
Wow.
Yeah, I've kind of been through that on some projects and I actually did that for some practice a couple of years ago, where I took some C# code and rewrote it in F#, and you can pretty much just, you could do OO F#, but it makes no sense to do that, right? But as a way to get started, that's a thing you could do, and then you walk through and figure out how to do things in a functional way. And it does take some time to just kind of get the, like, I guess, sort of the overall way of thinking about everything's an expression, and you avoid mutable data and all that stuff. Um, I tell people all the time, the thing that really made it work for me when I first started looking into it, there's a Pluralsight course where the guy points out that if you look at Gregor Hope's enterprise integration patterns,
Mm-hmm.
it's all the same things as functional programming, which I don't know if that works for very many people, but Gregor Hope's enterprise integration patterns was sort of my Bible for doing application integration. And that just made everything make sense to me. It's like, yeah, sure, I get that. And anytime you have a enterprise application integration project, you don't ever change the data that you get, right? some other process hands you a giant CSV file or whatever, right? You process that thing, but you don't change the original. You put out something new. And just that really made it much easier for me to get why you do the things you do. That and everybody who's doing F Sharp should go read the F Sharp for Fun and Profit site that Scott Washington did, because it is excellent.
Okay. Well, yeah.
So, question, John, on this project, what has made like F Sharp the choice for it? Why is it like, because you mentioned some of the disadvantages. What are the advantages?
So the main advantage from my perspective is when you're going to do a web app, I have found that if you have more than one half of a developer, having types helps. Okay, so maybe more than one developer. But I have found that, you get actually, let me rephrase it. When the amount of JavaScript you're writing gets more than I can put on my giant monitor, then I need types to help, right? And Fable is amazing because you can write most anything you could write for .NET, you can write in F Sharp and it will convert it into to TypeScript and JavaScript on the front end. And it has, you got source map, so you can debug into Chrome or, Edge debugger. You can walk through your code that way. And I find and this is basically a React app. This is Fable React. And so having worked on large React apps, I always end up getting lost with the props and all that stuff. It's like, what is this thing? Now, I will say this. It is great for writing new applications. It is much more of a struggle if you're going to try to take a React app and convert it over, because your assumptions about what's doable are completely different. Like, it's just so different.
Gotcha.
So this is React Fable that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's called Fable React, yeah. And it's basically it takes your F Sharp and converts it to React. And it uses Elvish. I don't know if you guys ever seen Elm, but it's basically model view update, where you start out with what is basically an HTML view, and you send it messages, which are your model, and that for every message you update the view. And since I'm like, my brain works in a message-oriented fashion anyway, it just really made sense to me. Now, I know other developers where it's like, that doesn't make any sense. What is going on here? But for me, it worked out great.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in seeing some of that. I know I spent like a day using Ohm for closure script one time. I was like, this feels like awesome. This feels like React, but like with a way better flavor. So I do know that some of that stuff is possible.
Yeah, I would say that, the thing you have to look for, everything's, balancing trade-offs, right? So the thing you have to watch out for is it becomes very easy to get, basically the center of your application is this giant pattern match where you're processing messages, right? It's very easy to let that just kind of get out of control, in the sense that, you have 15 stacked up pattern matches, and, you got to watch out for things like that. But in general, I find it a very natural way to think. It's like, the user did this thing, and then we update, the screen and what they see. And it's, I find it relatively straightforward. The only part that is a little hard for me to do, which I think is kind of hard for most everybody, if they're honest, is the asynchronous stuff. Reasoning about asynchronous code gets interesting at times.
Yeah. Okay. No, it can be, definitely. And that's why I did my Gym Gen stuff. Just makes it a little easier.
You just have to set yourself for some rules around how you're going to use it. You know.
That's true. That's always the case. Yeah. Now, I remember I've been on exactly one F# project, which was because like one of the guys at Surge, even when I first started and we were still small, was just a freaking gunner. This guy was like, he was a sort of developer that I once saw him like open up and a panel in Vim, which was just a raw bit stream, and like be debugging things from that. It was just like, oh my god. And he had knocked out some really some really high visibility project, and our CEO was like, whatever, next thing, let him do and whatever he wants. And he chose F#, and it was for a project that was making a PowerPoint to HTML converter, which is crazy project. Like, it's really complex stuff to do, but he actually got like a rudimentary version working, and like even like looking at the code, I was like, no, this isn't really F# is you're just using pattern matching and kind of using JavaScript patterns, but it works since it's a complex thing. Yeah. But then I remember yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that F# is really good for is doing DSLs.
Yeah.
And if I were going to approach a project like that, which I would avoid that kind of project like the plague.
Anything with PowerPoint in the title.
Anything that involves converting some private format to HTML is. But anyway, I would approach that kind of as a DSL, where I try to figure out how to, work the whole thing for a slide to some.
You would approach it that way, but have you ever looked at the PowerPoint format?
Oh yeah.
You really think you could do that as a DSL? Because that thing's nuts.
So I would start small. Because let's be honest, you're never going to be able to do everything in Power. 100%. Of the features in PowerPoint are never going to make it to HTML. So you start small and you build from there.
Yeah. No, I what I was gonna say was I just remember at one point like Verizon actually bought that code base from they licensed it or something like that. And I had to go out to Verizon and do like a handoff to them of it. And I remember like doing the handoff to the guy, and it was like, I'm handing it off to this guy who every single time I've ever come in their office, the first thing I see is just him face down asleep on his desk. And I'm handing him an F# code base that does all this stuff. There is no way they're going to be able to do anything. Like, they're just going to like put this on a box, and as long as it runs, and once it breaks, they're just going to give up and walk away from it. And like, it was just like so deflating to realize that.
It's the first time I've heard a reference of or I've heard DSL and F# in the same sentence. I had never thought of it, and so I had to look it up. I was gonna ask you guys, do you guys have like examples of DSLs in F#? I just looked up some articles. That's new to me.
So if you've ever done Azure Resource Manager templates.
I have not.
Oh, well, somebody wrote a DSL in F# for those, and it is about, I don't know, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,000,000 times easier than doing those stupid templates. So, because the templates are these JSON files, and it is just amazing. Anyway, look up Farmer sometime.
Farmer,
yeah. Just like, somebody who works on a farm.
Gotcha.
It's called Farmer. So, the F# people like to put F in front of everything. So. But the nice thing about it is it works kind of the way you would think about it. Like, okay, I want to set up this Azure website. I need some storage. I need some blob storage. I need this, and you just write the whole thing out, and then you say deploy. and you can tell it, where you want it to go and all this other stuff. And that was one of those things where it is super easy to see the advantage of doing, a DSL as opposed to trying to manage a JSON file format.
Right. Yeah, I'm totally down for DSLs. I just never thought that it would be something to do in F#. That's funny.
Well, then let me pitch you Racket, which is all about writing custom languages in DSLs.
Yes, I understand. One of these days, that's something I'm going to play with.
Yeah.
That is not today.
There's a whole book about it, and it's awesome. And I really need to get back to it tonight and start working my way through their examples, because getting my head around macros is rough. It shouldn't be as hard as it is. It really shouldn't be. But there's some specific syntax, and I'm sure I'm learning about it the wrong way, and I can't just all my extra learning is late at night after everyone goes to sleep, so there's only so much capacity I have to just sit down and read an entire article, as opposed I got to get everything down to the point of view where all right, I am writing down the sentence for the next thing I'm trying to do, and now I'm trying to do it. Yeah. That's my level.
I'm just going to try some. Oh, what's that?
Hey Brian, we're getting some. Your mic is on, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So, but yeah, Racket's. Love it. No, I really enjoyed it so far.
Yeah, you have been bringing it up every week, so it's at some point I should look more into it.
I'm moving into it. I'm moving it up as my just go-to scripting language right now. Literally this morning, I just had a big list of emails that I needed to do, but I was so dropped it in, started writing Python to wrap it in a set and stuff like that. And be no, I'm gonna do that in Racket, because it's it's not hard to do in any language, but it's just a more enjoyable experience in it. I don't have to write a thing that goes in and because it really is just a list of emails grab out a spreadsheet. I don't have to go in and put quotes around each one and then separate or anything like that, or a multi-line string which I split by a new line. It's just I put it in between parens and then it's a list, and make it quoted.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, having to do something and finding the more enjoyable thing to use. So for my personal side project things that I do, I still fall back to Ruby on Rails.
Really?
When I want to have fun and get something done real quick, that's what I use. It's so much easier, when I look, in comparison to all the .NET, the React, and all that stuff. Is no. I just need this one little thing here. It shouldn't be hard. Yep, done. Tested and all, and deployed.
And for people that don't know your background, Ruby on Rails is not at all your first original thing that you learned, right?
No. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna remember that, right? Because we worked on WPF projects, and that had been my background with .NET. I mean, after Fox Pro, I mean, I still have I have special love for the Fox, right?
It wasn't as bad as people remember. Yeah.
It was, for me, it was not bad at all. It was great. I delivered value to clients using that. So to me, it was great. And then, going into .NET and all that. And then I remember into .NET when I first looked into my first things doing web development was with just plain JavaScript and classic ASP in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. And the way that I used to use ASP was really just, using VB script to instantiate a COM component, call a method that returned HTML. My COM component being Foxborough components, because Foxborough was really quick at processing data and producing string, right? So I would just offload all of that to my components. I had a whole scripting thing that I could create. It was my own Fox script, right? Where I would have my HTML and then the the symbols to just put some VFP or Foxborough code in there, spit out all that HTML. That worked great. And then I get into .NET. I do mostly like WinForms and all that. And then when I look at web forms, I didn't like it. It didn't work well for me. Just the whole model of web forms, it just didn't, float my boat. So I just focus more on like WinForms and WPF. And then when I started looking at web apps again, that's when ASP.NET first came out. But by then I was like, okay, do I look into ASP.NET? But then JB at the time started showing all of the goodness of Ruby on Rails on our
I remember that.
Virtual brown bags back then. And I'm like, huh, that actually does look pretty good. And I remember him saying, dude, let's spend like an hour on the phone. I will walk you through like how you can do that same thing in Ruby on Rails, and then you decide. And that's what we did. And I'm like, holy crap, yeah, this is a lot more productive than the ASP.NET stuff that I was doing. And then I spent like 4 to 6 years mostly doing Ruby on Rails development, because again, it was at a time when I went independent. So I was playing like both the product owner, the scrum master, and the lead developer on the team. And that was really like, okay, I'm working with the business. I'm figuring out what they need, or actually they didn't know what they needed. I helped them actually develop the product that they needed, right? From concept really. And then leading a team that had, really great Rails developers. I was mostly like doing Ruby on Rails, but still with like a .NET accent, right? But even then, later when I came back to the .NET space, like I said, when I'm doing something on my spare time that I just want to get something done, that's still what I fall back to. And I'm probably not doing like the best Ruby on Rails development, if you will, because I don't keep up like with, okay, what is the latest and greatest version of the thing? It's like, I don't care. Whatever version I'm running right now, I get the stuff done.
And I mean, like, it's always been the strength of Rails, right?
Right.
It's like stuff that is on the rails, it's so quick to knock out.
Yeah.
That's
my thing. I just I don't, and it's funny because like I relate to like what John was saying about trying to use something that does not really map to what you normally do or how you like doing things. So I spent some time years ago with traditional Angular, or whatever we call
AngularJS.
right? Okay, I got that. I enjoyed it. It was great. And then I went on to do other things. And then I come back to doing more like front-end development. The first thing I run into is Knockout.js, which I didn't like, at least not the way that it was implemented, on a brownfield project. And then
I actually love Knockout, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
brownfield, fair enough. Yeah, you can make a mess with it.
Yes, exactly. So again, what I saw there, the way it was implemented, I'm like, okay, if this is how we're supposed to do Knockout.js, I don't like it. It looks very, bad. And then, at the previous client, so I spent about 2.5 years doing some React work, and still it never clicked for me. It's not something that like, okay, if I have some spare time and I'm gonna do front-end development, React is not at the top of my list. It just doesn't work with the way that I think for whatever reason. And then I said, okay, now let me look at whatever the current version of Angular is, just to see how does it compare to what I knew from Angular.js, and does it look anything like React, whatever. Just let me learn what it is. And like right off the bat, it clicked better for me. It's like it just fits better the way I think. Now, I don't know if it's because of like my C# background, my model view model background, or if there's something else in the way that my brain works that model seems to like make more sense for me. What do you guys think? I mean,
Well, I actually came from Well, one funny thing is I have a background with DBase 3 Plus and 4 Fox Pro,
Yeah.
so I'm still virtual high five, my man.
Absolutely.
Clipper.
I came
Uh,
from
I'm still a little
eBay.
angry at Microsoft. They wrote a white paper when they purchased Ashton Tate saying, "Oh, we're not going to gut it. We're not going to get rid of it." To this
Yep.
day, I'm still angry because they lied to me. But
Yeah,
I've
I came
actually
from
done
the
some
same
work.
background, man. Because you
Yeah,
know, in Brazil, Clipper and DBase, they were huge. So that's
yes,
where I come from ultimately.
yeah, they were great. They were quick. But yeah, I did. I kind of followed a similar path. Went from I guess you say the X-Base world over to
Yeah.
ASP and then ASP.NET with the first versions of I think it's VB.NET and then C#.NET. Then also branched over to some of the Laravel, PHP frameworks, CodeIgniter, Zend, um, then Laravel. But one of the things that came to mind when you mentioned React is that I found the learning curve when I was using some of the JavaScript related frameworks like Vue.js pretty quick to adapt to. I actually took a course on React, and even though I came up to speed pretty quickly, the way in which that course was done was instead of it being more of a MVC, like drop these files here, drop these other files there, bam, you're done. One of the things I found was a little more difficult with React and Redux was, the way I learned it was building components. And then in some cases, the argument of whether to keep your JavaScript separate or to do JSX, which would be compiled JavaScript within the React. And then there was also, other philosophies of adding in things like reducers and whether I want to use Firebase or the other things that are all out there. So I did find it a little more, I guess you say, daunting to get up to speed with React than I did with, for instance, Vue.js. Vue.js was really quick. I think that's why it's grown pretty quickly. JavaScript, whether it's from jQuery UI, or vanilla JavaScript, learning Vue.js was very easy learning curve. I thought React was a little more tedious.
Right. Yes. And just to acknowledge comments that Alper put up there, he said, upgrading Rails is the most painful for me. Don't touch Rails for 6 months or so. Try to run it again. Everything breaks. I guess if you if you pull latest versions of gems or stuff, because I've been, I still have two apps in production, like running in Rails that I haven't updated at least in like 10 months or so, and I haven't had any issue. But I haven't upgraded like to whatever the latest version of Rails is. So yeah, I'll definitely keep that in mind. Thanks for the pointer, Alper. And yeah, Brian, there is one thing. Thanks for sharing that, by the way. Something that was a huge thing for me when I first looked at React, and I always shared this with people. So back when I first started looking at web development, I remember the time when we had there's this HTML file, right? The extension is HTML, right? And then we look at the file and we see not only HTML, but we also see style sheets, right? And we also see the JavaScript, all in the same HTML file. Eventually, somebody figured out, well, the HTML file should have HTML, CSS should have styles, and JS should have JavaScript. That made a lot of sense to me, right? That separation. And then the first thing that I look at in React, I see the same thing. I'm seeing this one file with the extension JS or JSX, but I'm reading JavaScript, CSS, and HTML all in the same file. And I'm saying, look, guys, really? Is this how we're supposed to be writing React? We are back to where we were 20 years ago, just with a different extension. That makes no sense to me, right? And I had some people defend that, saying, oh, but it's a component. Everything has to go together. It's like, I get that concept, but can't they go together in the same folder, right? So you have a component inside of a folder, and then you split that into, this is JavaScript, this is HTML, this is CSS. What's the problem with that? that's where
Funny,
I got.
the way I learned it, it actually is done that way, where you will have a folder that has a specific uh, component, but within that folder for that component, it is separated out to a JS file, CSS or SCSS, et cetera. So I guess it depends on the way in which you learn it, and I guess if you've learned it online, through an online tutorial versus the way in which I learned it was from a course where he did advocate having a folder per component, but then separating the styles and the JavaScript within that. So maybe I was fortunate enough to learn it, at least from that perspective, a better way where there is some separation. But yeah, I've seen some of those single page scripts, literally. I know it's supposed to be an SPA, but I still think within a single page application, we don't have to be so literal to cram everything into one file. And I think it makes it harder to migrate or to scale. If you have an application where it's now starting to grow, and let's say somebody wants to change one thing, I want to be able to just go to one spot for the CSS and change it there, and it's globally changed, as opposed to if everything's stored out into separate files, do I now have to go across 20, 30, 100 scripts to make that one change? So I'm definitely an advocate for separation of code based upon its function.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll jump in and defend it then with the counterpoint. So
you go first.
So first of all, like when I came to React, I guess my background at that point. So, I professionally I actually started in PHP and then .NET, but then like I think I left DPS soon after, a little bit after you did, Claudio, and like the reason I left was because like I had been getting into web stuff around 2010, and then just we weren't getting a lot of web work, and I actually even sat down I think with Marcus and was like, there's not a lot of point to me being here because you're having me do like these like projects to maintain Milos, and like you're not getting that much value out of it, and I'm not that interested in it. And he was like, yeah, cool, I'll get you a recommendation, sure. So I went in and like I started searching, and like they were doing a lot of front end stuff. Like so, like at the time it was jQuery, but like actually understanding jQuery, doing jQuery UI, well structuring stuff with components, writing a ton of custom stuff components. So and then we did lots of knockout and things like that. So by the time I kind of got to React, I already had a lot of opinions about how JavaScript should be structured, how you should be coding in the web browser. And that I think is what helped a lot, because when I actually learned Java or React, I didn't even go to React first. I took so someone had extracted just the virtual DOM part of React into its own library. It's called Virtual DOM by Matt Esch, and I just practiced writing a little app with just virtual DOM. So essentially ended up building and using my own opinions on it, and essentially ended up building a React style thing up by myself, right?
Okay.
Because it really is React is just like a pretty thin wrapper over virtual DOM concepts. And then they throw in JSX, and I never understood why they did that, because we spent like 20 years trying to get away from HTML syntax and inventing Pug and Haml and all that stuff. And it's like, now we're just doing this again? I could just use a JavaScript function, and that looks a lot like Haml. Like, that looks good, actually. And it's easier to track through. But so that helped me a lot, and that's the reason I like React a lot. I was like, this is simple. The other conceptually the reason I like React a lot is that it's stupid simple to make components, which to me is the entire point of a UI frame, of a UI framework, UI library. It's not to model bind, blah, 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 blah. I'll figure out how to do that. I know how to code in JavaScript. I know the language well. What I need is a component abstraction, and I'm going to be making tons of components, and I need it to be as simple as making a function. I don't want to create a folder. I don't want to create a file. I don't want to create any. If I'm working in a file, and I'm working inside a component, I'm like, you know what, this should actually be a component. even this one line of JSX, this should probably be a component because I'm going to evolve it later. I should just be able to create a function in that file directly there that just abstracts that way, the same exact way that you would abstract helper functions away in any other language. That's the way to think of it. It's helper function. It's a way you're making helper functions. Now, as far as mixing CSS, JS, HTML together, the reason why it was in separate files to begin with is not because separation of concerns is cleaner or blah 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 blah. It had nothing to do with that. The reason why JavaScript was in its own file is because it has a completely different caching strategy than the HTML one. That's the reason you put it in. It's also initially wasn't a mandatory part of the page. So you wouldn't necessarily want to spend time downloading at a time when bits and bytes really mattered. CSS is actually the same way. So CSS style sheets, the style, it was, and the reason it's a link element and not style src equals whatever, is because it was initially just like it was initially visualized by the guys that proposed it. Not as an integral part of the document. It was a link to one of many different metadata links for the document that just contained suggestions on how to display the document. Remember, those are all suggestions. At the time that CSS was proposed, which was in the 90s, you still had computers running green screen and so on. So what does that mean for something to say this font should be way larger and should be blue when you don't have the ability to display larger font or to do blues, right? It's just a series of suggestions, and therefore it goes into a separate file so that it can be pulled in separately. It could be pulled in or not pulled in, basically. Let the browser have that decision, because again, you're working on saving bits and bytes and different caching strategies. So that was the reason for it. Mixing stuff like that in the same file, when done poorly, was bad. But if you do it well, you have separate areas for that. Like, it really is only bad from the point of view to me of, well, it's because the caching stuff now makes that harder, right? Because you're just transferring more data than you need to. You can't minify it easily and stuff like that. That's really the majority reason of why it's bad. And I mean, we wrote at Surge, we wrote very complex applications where we were doing stuff like that. We'd have stuff like that, and then it would allow us to write components that were specific to a particular page. And I mean, like, as far as like navigating around in your text editor, get a better text editor. I mean, I don't know.
Well, that's the point that I make there, and thanks for going over like the technicalities of things, like explaining things that I was not even aware of before. So I appreciate that. And when I talk about that separation, I'm thinking more about the communication between the code and the person reading, right? Because like a comparison that I draw, an analogy that I use, a lot of Brazilians, right, they are butchering the Portuguese language in such a way that it's being hard for me to communicate, because they are introducing or adopting English words right in the middle of the sentences in Portuguese, but they are using the English words in the wrong way. So when they're communicating, they're saying, Portuguese, 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 this English word, Portuguese, Portuguese. And then it may make sense if you're living in that context. They know that, okay, that English word for our context here means the same. For me, I speak both languages, but I have a hard time following because they are using English in the wrong manner. So it's like Spanglish kind of thing. So when I see like JavaScript and HTML and all that all mixed up, that's usually the problem because of the way it's being used. Like you said, it can work well if it's well written, if it's well organized. That's the problem, that a lot of developers, they don't think that way, right? For example, one example that's, I think I even blogged about it, where I looked at this JSX code where there was, in the JavaScript part, there was if this condition and this condition and this condition, next line, and this condition and this condition, and then double ampersand HTML.
And that's why it needs to be easy to make components, because that should be handled in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here with a couple of things. So when it comes to CSS, okay, I was actually there. And here's what I mean by that. In 1998 or 99, I went to this Microsoft conference back when they were still doing the Professional Developers Conference. And there was this guy named Wycon Lee, who was the guy who wrote the spec for CSS.
Yeah. This is a
And
graduate.
he did this presentation on this new proposal he had for this thing called CSS. And we're not using it anything like it was intended. So the C part, the cascade, everybody now just avoids it because it's too confusing. But it, originally it was like, okay, there's this top level style sheet that is the users, and they get to control everything. Because, you need stuff for people who have handicaps or, people who have certain kinds of screens, blah, 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 right? But in the real world, what happened is no developer can actually keep the cascade in their head. I mean, it just doesn't happen, right? And so we all, we went down all these different ways of doing CSS. And, I used to be in some ways I still am in Claudel's camp about how you don't mix all this stuff up. And now I'm using this tool right now, and I'm going to paste a little bit of code, and we'll see how this works. Oh, that's terrible. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can get this to look like code. Does they have the? I don't know. Okay, well, we'll try.
Just hacked all of our computers.
So while you're doing that, I'll add, because like the cascade stuff it's a little more complex. I mean, you were there. I wasn't there, but like I've read stuff by him where he's written this, where as initially conceived, the cascade was even more than that. Like for each rule, you would have like a decimal that you would add next to it and be like 0.6, and be like, that would be the value that your preference should get versus
there is a whole weighting system built into it that literally no one ever uses.
That no one ever used, but it like demoed really well because there were sliders, and that's why they yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, so this code that I just pasted in is a slightly cleaned up version, and the formatting is terrible, so you can't. But basically, the brackets are Fsharp lists, which are like just a single linked list kind of construct, right? And what they did in this is they give you a way to create a component. By the way, the result of that let logo equal, that returns a React element. Okay. And what you're saying is, okay, I want this div that's a block that has an image that's 128 by 128, and the source is this thing over here, right? And you've just mixed up, your HTML and your JavaScript and your CSS, but guess what? You don't actually see any of that, right? Yeah. What you see is this almost declarative sort of thing about like, here's what I want. Here's where, it's not quite perfect, but as I've used this, I've really come to understand it's like, if you can put a layer on top of it where you don't have to switch, because the hard part about like, a style tag or something inside your HTML is that your mind has to swap, you got to swap out all the HTML crap, right? And swap in all your CSS understanding, right? And this is much more about like, you learn the way this thing works. It's like, okay, yeah, you have this image, and an image has some properties to it. You set those things, and like, I don't have to think about all the nasty React crap going on underneath that. But what I see when I type that in is the logo shows up exactly where I want it to be, the size I wanted it, and everything's good. And, for a simplistic little, I never said I was a smart programmer, but I stuck around for a long time by figuring out, okay, what's the simple way to deliver value for the customer?
Right.
And, I tell people I use Fsharp, and people's like, oh, you must be some like, really smart, data. I don't know any of that crap. Like, I'm an old VB programmer. I like it because you don't have semicolons at the end of the line. No. No, I really think if I had it to do over again in my career, if I knew then what I know now, I would have skipped C# and gone straight from VB.NET to F#. Now, I might not have been able to find a job at the time. However, I would have been much happier.
Okay.
And I will say, like, I don't know. So the chat is not refreshing for me, so I don't see what you type. But what you describe sounds a lot like styled components or emotion in React, which I'm a big fan of. What? And it works a similar way. And I've kind of said for a long time, ever since I kind of ever since I did a deep dive into the history of CSS and like did a bunch of research on it because I do a talk about the history of the web. There's like CSS as a whole is probably wholly inadequate for where we need the web to go. Like if we're talking about AR on the web, and I mean like I'm in the Slack for the W3C and I just listen to them talking a little bit. They talk a lot about immersive experiences, AR, stuff, VR. How the hell are you going to do any of that with CSS? It's
CSS is for documents, man. It's for displaying things on the screen or on paper. Nobody ever did the paper part of it other than I got Lee's company print.
Yeah, and there is a thing called Sprint Style Sheet, but like no browser supports it well, which is very frustrating because like I try to print my resume to PDF and my resume is a web page and it doesn't quite work. But like there, it's not like there weren't options before CSS came around. There were multiple options. Some of them were really cool. One of them, DSSSL, was of course a scheme because it's always a scheme first. And it was really, really good. And it was really cool. And there was some very specific, like, it was complex, so people were scared of it. And then there were a couple technical reasons with regards to like how it worked that was not what Microsoft chose to pick in IE2 and to promote. But that's all stuff that wouldn't even like matter for the type of stuff. So for example, like the big thing that like it's a scheme, so you can kind of do everything. But the one of the big reasons why that was actually not selected and put on the back burner was, well, if you can do anything, then let's say the way you color this element might depend on some fact about some element further down the page. And if you think about it in 1998 terms, well, you're loading the page a bit at a time. You want to be able to render it as soon as possible. That means you want to be able to render the top of the page before the bottom of the page has even loaded, so you wouldn't be able to apply styling to it because you don't know whether there's a condition that depends on something further on. So it's like a pure technical reason like that they were like, oh, I can't do that one. It's too complex. And why it ended up with something simpler as CSS. And like, I think we have to like evolve because, again, how are you going to do AR, VR with it? Which means styling is going to have to move into JavaScript or whatever, WebAssembly.
I have a simple response on the AR/VR, which is just don't. But that's don't. Not on the web. I just like
it, but it's not bad. And also, I mean, the web's just a delivery mechanism at this point, right? Yeah, I mean, like, yes, all our web pages are basically like one of two designs right now, but like they don't have to be. Like, I want a web page where I could just kind of scroll by waving my hand in front of my webcam. Yeah, and then there's a rear-facing webcam that's like taking things from the back and putting them in the right area. Yes, I would love that. There are good, useful cases for that. Do I want to be able to drop my glasses on and walk around like a virtual experience or something? Yes. Eventually, aframe.io is great. Like it's a wonderful step in that direction, but we need good ways to style this. Yeah. And just don't see how we're like, it's not going to be possible, CSS. You're going to have to be doing it with some sort of coding language, or something that's not just declarative. There's that old saw that every single declarative language like slowly becomes a procedural one, right? And I mean, we're going to have to see something like that happen.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
But every non-declarative language eventually has someone propose a DSL that will make a declarative sublanguage of it too. It goes both ways.
Yeah, we've been all over the map here. Very cool.
Yeah, I didn't even get to touch on any of the stuff I had jotted down. All right. I'll throw this out there recently. I did a thing. I was reading about stuff. I was arguing with someone about PHP yesterday, and basically that we should be careful about razzing PHP too much. It's first of all kind of not fair and discouraging to PHP developers, but it's really not that bad as a language anymore. And yes, it has a lot of legacy stuff and a lot of crappy code that's not updated in it, but the language itself's all right, and there are a lot of PHP jobs. And so if you go overboard with razzing it, then that's going to discourage people who need jobs from applying and learning and applying to those jobs that need to be filled. And I don't want to encourage that, but I did get into an argument with a security guy about why exactly PHP is bad or whatever, and he pointed me to something called type juggling in PHP, which is really, really interesting. And it's the basic idea that when you use the equals equals in PHP, it's similar to JavaScript where it's a loose comparison operator. So, and they're you don't ever use equals equals. You always use triple equals. But unlike JavaScript, well, not that JavaScript rules are straightforward, but there's some really, really crazy additional rules in PHP. For example, if you're comparing two strings and PHP decides that they kind of look like numbers, it'll try to convert them to numbers first, which can be used from a hacking point of view. Because let's say you're comparing password hashes. You're comparing if you know that so you can kind of control the password you submitted, right, and the password so let's say the hash of the password starts with something like 0e. Yeah, perfectly reasonable way for a password hash to start. 0 and an e. The chances of that would be 1 out of 36 times 36, right? And then, if you take that and you fashion your input so that it can generate a 0e, another hash that starts with 0e, and PHP will compare them, will be like, oh, 0e, these are both numbers, convert both of them to integers, and it'll convert both of them to 0, and then compare the 0, and now you got and now you've got a valid hit on the hash. It's called type juggling, and I spent some time yesterday researching it. It's really, really interesting hacks available with it. They're just wild. I'll post it in the Slack.
Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, this was a great discussion. Yeah, Brian says it's been a great discussion, regardless of us jumping through things. I do agree. Thanks everybody for showing up and contributing to the conversation. This was great. One of the the best VBBs we've had this far. Very cool.
Me from last week is sad now.
No, it's all good stuff. It's getting better and better. Thanks everybody. Have a nice afternoon and weekend, and hope to see you back next week.
All right, thank you guys.
See ya.